Thank you everyone for joining us today for the launch of the Influencing Machine. I am Carmen Casiuc, the president of EUXIN, the Utopian Society, an NGO based in Bucharest dedicated to promoting the common heritage of the Black Sea, and a curator by profession with a background in history of art. Next to me is Aaron Moulton, a curator, researcher from Utah in America, who became quite present into the Romanian landscape a few years ago with a series of exhibitions exploring the occult in the art world. He then commissioned a series of 3 exhibitions for Galleria Nicodem, 2017, 2019, and last time he was here, he opened the exhibition that initiated this longer project, the Influencing Machine. I would like to start this conversation by first remembering that first chapter of the book and how it all began.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me here. Thank you, MARe Museum, and everyone for coming. It's really an honor to be here in Bucharest to present this book because it really represents the end of a journey for me. This is where I first made the exhibition in 2019, and Bucharest is very special for me as a human being and for my human experience and everything I've learned in whatever my work represents. I think that's really because of this place, and so this is a project that is more than a project for me. It's a research study and an obsession, and it starts when I'm very young. When I'm 25, I was editor of Flash Art, and I was at a moment in my life that I felt very versed in the globalization of the art world and in different art worlds. Prior to Flash Art, I was already quite nerdy with this stuff and understanding the different growth, mutations of the art world. But Flash Art really made it to where I had to be, providing coverage and have that much more of an intense interest. And it was during that work that this reference of the SCCA, the Soros Center for Contemporary Art Network, started to pop up. I saw it, and I just thought that's funny. That's funny. That sounds like a chain of institutions. And I can't even remember the first one that I saw. But as soon as you start to look for it, then you find another and another and another, and then I just thought, Jesus, there's so many of these. Why is this not spoken about? In my education at the Royal College of Art, which was a curatorial degree, they're pretty good about giving you histories of curatorial practice, and they're also at the same time training you in post-colonial theory and really guiding your practice towards what we now have as a socially engaged practice. And so I thought it was kind of crazy. No one ever talked about this. We had people even at the school that were sort of Reluca Voina, who are kind of related to it in some post generational way. So when I started seeing it when I was at Flash Art, I thought, there's a research study here that I can gave me a good excuse to think in a really structural way about how I could dive into the different art worlds of Eastern Europe. And in 2006, I did a research study where I just went around to 10 cities, 8 which had SCCAs, and then Kosovo and Kaliningrad, and it was just going to be a reportage of post-Soros art scenes, and I was going to interview people, and because I was from Flash Art, everybody opened their doors to me, and I was able to it was an incredibly hospitable moment in my career, and I met all these amazing artists and all these amazing practitioners, and I didn't meet a real Soros person until I was in Skopje, Macedonia. I was only meeting people that were from the post generation in every place I went. And it was in Skopje I met a guy named Nebojša Ilić, who ran the Soros Center in Skopje. And Nebojša and I sat down for an interview. I was recording all these interviews that became the beginning of an oral history archive, which I've been building. And when we sat down for this interview, I went to, I didn't know what to ask him. I was not sure what to talk to him about, and I was not thinking very critically. It was like naive and enthusiastic. Well, let's talk about your scene, let's talk about what magazines were there in the 90s, really nothing that was going to be deep diving. And before he let me record, I was about to hit record, and he's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Before you hit record, I want to be clear on something. I don't want to talk at all about who did the programming, how the programming was decided, who chose what. We're not going to talk about any of that. I just want to be clear about that, okay? I was like, okay, no problem. I wasn't going to ask you any of that, but okay, no problem. And that became an earworm for me. It just lived inside my head. And then what followed from Flash Art, I ended up having a gallery in Berlin called Feinkost, where I represented all these artists that I met all through that journey, who I thought were markets that no one was tapping. If George Soros invested in it, all it needs is a price tag and someone's going to buy it. And so I was representing all these great biennial artists who benefited from the network. Lucizar Boyagia, Daniel Baker from the Roma Pavilion. It was a really pan-Eastern European program. And within that, I had a curatorial practice that I was constantly using ideas that were kind of inspired mostly from dialogues from these artists, not directly from the network at that point. But that becomes a major inspiration for me. And then it kind of lays dormant for me as just a passive passion in my head, always wondering about the role of NGOs in contemporary art. And I could continue a practice of traveling to different regions and keeping that dialogue going, always asking people, what did the SCCAs mean for you? And all passive, just I'm a fan, I never stopped being a fan of these things. And then Mihai Nicodeme and I had a really great dialogue, and we just suddenly started talking about it, and I was like, dude, I could make a show out of this. I could make a really, really fucking cool show that would look at this thing in a hard way. And he was just really, willing to, allow me to make anything I wanted in this way that was like, no questions asked. I could just do amazing stuff. And he was psyched. And so he let me do this research project that was a fast, deep dive. I started collecting interviews, and then I started getting artists on board, and I had this really clear idea not to do something political, but to do something that materialized an idea of influence, and that we can imagine is easy to politicize, but let's pull it back and let's just think about the idea of energy and how it passes, and let's look at it pre-politically. And I built an archive that was a really good archive. I had the help of an archivist who helped me build it, and I needed this archive. I knew that if I could build an archive, because also that's invoking what the SCCAs did. One of the first big rituals was that they got people to make archives of their lost unofficial art worlds of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and then built on that for the 90s and forward. So I thought I need to make an archive about them, so profiling each one of those centers like they profiled artists. And I knew that if I could make that archive, that I could see a pattern, and I knew it would be there, and it was. And in that pattern, I saw things that I didn't know how to communicate clearly when I did the show in 2019. But then when I got commissioned by the Zamek Ujazdowski, I knew that I was going to be able to take this to the place I needed to take it to. And that pattern, essentially, I think we can talk about, what the specifics of those patterns were. But that's the long story of me in this funny subject.
I would like to go a little bit back in what you were saying about your curatorial practice before the story of the influence, because you have this unusual way of using language on a subject that is most of the time approached in a very different terms. You talked about the network of the NGO and the idea of materializing this influence.
Hmm.
And many times when you talk about your book, you use these unusual words like cultural voodoo and the exorcism practice of it. And I want to see where are these coming from.
Yeah. So I believe in a very pan ideological form of it's like it's anthropology technically, but I'm not a typical I'm a gonzo anthropologist. I never studied anthropology, uh, but I know these are hats that if you know how to wear them, you can wear them. It's like speaking a language, and I do field work of my own, and I do a very particular kind of anthropology. It's called participatory anthropology, where you kind of deep dive and you maybe lose yourself a bit within that dive. You're building a cosmology and maybe you're at the center of it. And that's what curatorial practice is. You know, it's really, truly, it's a you're building a world, a temporary autonomous zone, an anthropological, syntactical statement of culture. You're putting words on it, and now with all these practices, it's forming a big, long sentence or idea or laboratory, and it exists for a small moment in time. And I believe that there's a whole way to apply that language. I've allowed my language to always be ever adaptable. So I don't just work in art. I work in the occult and in pseudoscience and in new religious groups and literally anything. I'm not religious to any one group or any one ideology. I believe all of them have something to offer, and if you're non-judgmental about it, you can receive a lot of information. If you allow yourself. And so I love the placebo effect. I'm probably most religious about the placebo effect. And I'm a seeker. I know that no one has the answer. And so I'm looking anywhere for anything that can give me some hints and some clues. And working with shaman, new religious groups, prophets, all these people, they all use art in their own way. And it's like a spiritual technology. And I believe the aboriginal function of art is as a way to nourish transcendental aspirations. And we've just kind of atheatized it, politicized it in all these different particular ways. But that's only about 100 years old, as a thing that we're doing. So I learn all these tricks, and I'm very open-minded, and I look at them as like tools for my kit that I use on myself personally for my own person and mental health or well-being, spiritual interests, and but I also apply them, not just I like coming up with philosophies, but I like applying them, and coming up with these words. That's really what we do. That's what artists do, right? They're there to operate in a gap that civilizations inadequately kind of given in terms of how we understand concepts and reality and objects and social phenomena, and we permit the artist to operate in this green zone of madness or in socially inappropriate places or what have you, and we allow it because we call it art. And that's a placebo effect when you go and do that. So you're literally permitting things that you might be really uncomfortable with if they happen to you on the street from a homeless person. But in the art context, you'll pretty much let it go and accept it as something that is fun or whatever. So yeah.
Uh, I would like to introduce to the audience what are you think the patterns that could present the NGO network as a spiritual or something that relates to energy in the context of an Eastern European period in itself very charged from political aspects.
Well, that's a. I think I have to introduce these three patterns, and then we can kind of talk about that.
Mm-hmm.
My research, in a nutshell, is looking at the way in which the Soros Center for Contemporary Art Network, which is a network of 20 centers that happen throughout Eastern Europe from 92 to 99. There's 20 of them. Every major city, Belgrade, Tallinn, Riga, wherever, suddenly, overnight, had this asymmetrically powerful NGO appear. And literally kind of giving them a new model, a new paradigm for the art world and for cultural production, and a promise of a whole network of in the potential of playing in the larger art world. And they anticipate, the SCCA network anticipates the biennial movement, the biennial moment that we have in the mid 90s. So it's 95 really is when biennials start to spike. And so the SCCA network, I think the real rubber hits the road in terms of where you see these patterns from 92 to 95. And by 95 to 99, it's kind of, they're all relatively autonomous and forming their own identities. And there's this early moment where all these centers, when they pop up, they're selecting people that are not curators. They're dissidents, or they're poets, or they're random, people that are, vetted to run this thing. But they're not curators many times, and so they don't. And then on top of that, they're operating in a place that, in specific cases, like Chisinau, Moldova, they didn't know this idea of contemporary art the way we had it in the West, and so there's a great thing that happens when you have 20 centers. Each one's a case study, and you should treat each one like a case study. The way the Soros Center network interacted in each place is different. You can't go and take what I'm saying and claiming it as a universal rule. But the fact that when you have 20, you have data. You have a lot of data that overlaps in a really interesting way, and in terms of the success and the failure, the implementation of ideas, and the impact. And so the thing that I saw, and you only really get to see this in the book, I've done two things. You have these great maps, which really allow you to see this, the scope of this thing. So here's all the centers. I've even included the four that nobody knows about that were supposed to happen, but that didn't. Tirana, Lviv, Minsk, and Novosibirsk. But this map is my research. This is the viral effect of what this thing represents. And what this is a timeline of exhibitions, and it shows the simultaneous emergence, the emergent behavior phenomena of stuff that is landing in these places, in some cases like a UFO, and it has no prior real history. And here in the book, I've got an addendum section where you can look at that map through data. So this is a timeline, and you get to see like that in 1994 they did 5 very similar exhibitions that happen at the exact same time. Now, ideas in the art world don't travel that fast, especially in a pre-digital era. You don't have like this simultaneous emergence of pop art in 5 cities. It's like it takes a minute, and Definitely doesn't happen in former closed societies. So that's already unusual. And what was this emergence? I look at the Soros Center for Contemporary Art Network as being as giving the most advanced form of socially engaged practice that we've ever seen in the history of socially engaged practice. If we have to do a forensic accounting of the emergence of socially engaged practice as a collective phenomenon, not the individuals, but as a collective art scene suddenly moving around socially engaged practice, it is an asymmetrically advanced and artificially introduced phenomenon that happens via the NGO. And that is delivered through the most advanced form of the curator that we've ever seen in the history of the profession. And I can be really specific about what I mean with that, but I'm a curatorial historian, and a gonzo one. But I can tell you there's tactics of curatorial practice that the network is using simultaneously. That's the art of bureaucracy, the use of sacred sites, using artists to perform the duties of the NGO. If we can imagine that the NGO has the Open Society Network has specific agendas within how it's interacting with society and financial markets, legal markets, education, healthcare, culture, media space, all these different areas are arms of the NGO, and art was one. So for me, this project is this incredible way to enter into the entirety of the NGO, because we can see the entire agenda through different kinds of projects. So social engaged practice, curatorial practice, and then there's this story that I really enjoy about the emergence of tactical media as an emergent phenomenon, which comes from the earliest days of the network and from network culture. But it's network culture that's quite facilitated by the SCCA network. And it's with people like Gert Levink and Keiko Say and people that are adjacent to the network, but always there, traveling to all the different locations and in a way mentoring this new generation of artists that are trying to find their way within the network itself. And tactical media is not art. It often can be called art. Tactical media is mostly going to be associated with easily on an everyday basis with marketing and advertising and tricks, memes. Memes are tactical media. In art, you'd think of somebody like Marcel Duchamp. He's performing acts of tactical media. That's art because I say so. These become shamanic, linguistic moments of how the artist has this incredible opportunity to, through their power, completely change how we consider a phenomenon or create phenomenon situations. So those are the three things that I think are the real core areas of the research. And yeah, that answer.
Yes, and I would go even farther to say that it's this link between anthropology and curatorial practices that becomes interesting when it looked as a kind of meaning making.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And when it comes to meaning making, then you have this structure that began with your study of the archive. How is the archive a ritual?
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's a great question. Because I say so. Tactical media. No, because that is the this point of entry. The NGO. The story when we talk about the SCCA, we're always in this political conflict zone of like, why don't you think that was a good thing? And it's like, I'm not trying to do this good bad thing. I'm trying to look at influence. But a lot of people are going to use this whole philanthropic relationship to art as a kind of a weapon to prevent you from, to debunk your argument. What's wrong with supporting humanitarian causes? What's wrong with supporting art? And I want to come out right now and say this is not art. When you call it art, it's a way to help misunderstand what the power of this thing was. It's easy to call it art. It's an easy way to, and calling it art helps normalize it in your mind, but this is a trick of tactical media. Of course, art did come out of it. This was done through the work of the artists, but when we look at it from this macro view and when we break it down with anthropological language, it's not art. There's something else that's happening, and it has more to do with social engineering. And so the creation of the archive is one of these very friendly, important points of entry. That they used to demonstrate the integrity of their mission. And just for the record, I believe that the SCCA, technically, if we really have to go and flip a coin, it's a good thing. I believe it's a good thing. Everything they tried to do was all with good intentions. But I also believe that the people doing it at the time didn't really know what they were a part of. And so the creation of the archive was a way to legitimize an alternate route, an alternate path of art history, cultural production, and the understanding of the self, the creative self on a new path. And so they were looking primarily at all these lost, the art practice from the lost decades of the 60s, 70s, 80s under communism, what gets called unofficial art or conservative avant-gardes or other kinds of these things that were not being looked at properly with mainstream socialist realism, and or things that were counter to socialist realism. So they suddenly were turning that into this rationale, almost. So like collect all these lost histories. that demonstrate the human's desire for the open society. This resistance to authoritarian, this resistance to the closed society, that happens through these anomalies. Ultimately, mutations within that happen in hiding in the unofficial practice. And in doing so, you would write this history that then we can build upon in the 90s. It rationalizes the whole practice of what they would be then producing in the decade of the 90s. And then those archives would become essentially the foundations and the cornerstone for understanding these different relationships of contemporary art, unofficial art, as a new path for helping rewrite history. And so, anyways, and I look at it as a ritual, as an initiation rite, because it's this first moment of giving over to the network somehow. And this is a stretch a little bit, because I think there's other clearer points of initiation rite where artists are giving themselves over to this thing, but it's this kind of first moment where they're establishing themselves in this way that's like academic ritual.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But what were the findings of the archives of the Soros Centers? Did you find like raw materials of these archives of the centers, or who were the guardians of the original archives?
These archives are of artists. They're of profiles of artists. So it's like they had experts select 10 of the most important artists from the lost decades, and then they would build out binders or folders with slides. They'd get a curator or an art historian to write a text, and it became this single location where a visiting curator, these were essentially made it easy for any visiting outside international curator to come and get a quick dip into the art scenes of these places that were pretty hard to navigate at that time. And so there was nothing about these archives. These archives are interesting in terms of how they represent a selection process, what they were looking for in terms of defining contemporary art in this unofficial form. But my archive is different. My archive is like, I'm looking at the centers as the artist, So what my archive was doing was putting together the whole histories of the curatorial practice of each center, press releases, but where it gets special is, I was in some centers were having more information than others. Some I have none, like the folders in my archive for Belgrade is kind of empty. But the really crucial, one of the crucial things I've been able to find are things like the open call documents, which are the first point of entry to the artist communities in terms of how they're starting to change the way in which artists think about their own creative practice.
So is the archive a sort of the agenda of the network that they were putting on the table for the curators to focus on while they were working on a specific social context?
So the centers, they had multiple functions. They were these archive resource centers, so you go there to look at archive material, magazines or books or what have you, and then they would have this other function that kind of would overlap in various ways with the larger NGO, so working with publishing and other production of media and information around culture, and then there's the annual exhibition, which is the big curatorial experiment that would happen every year at every center. So there's 20 centers, and every year all 20 of them, like turning on a machine, would go boom, here's our new concept, and it's in these open calls you kind of see them unveiling this concept and the strict ways in which they're looking that artists turn their practice into this. But then what you ultimately find when you do historical research about this is you only really will find the press releases, and the press releases are like a funny alibi that say there was an open call that says we want art, like for 01010101, this exhibition that happened in 1994 in Bucharest, curated by Colin Dan. It literally says, let me read it for you. I've got it reproduced here. That's what I've done with my little book. I've put these open calls in because they are so good. Romania is breaking the electronic frontier. The second annual exhibition of SCCA Bucharest keeps the focus on the new media. An international jury will select 19 projects according to the theme, the artistic discourse as a reflection of the community and its consequent goals. To research the capacities of the artists to assume a social identity beyond the limits of their status, to debate the potential crisis developing in critical areas of society, to explore the interactive potential of communities living outside of the information. Agenda. July to October. The artists will work in villages, factories, mental institutions, slums, hospitals, etc., in order to develop a strategy of assimilation which may or may not become a substantial site-specific art event. The whole process will be documented and compiled in order to be transmitted via email, facsimile, telephone, and then some other stuff. But there's this urgency that's you can hear in the tone of this that's already kind of intense. This is a humanitarian crisis that this thing is fighting for. There's this reality that a lot of the artists that participated in this didn't have practices that did that. So it was unusual for them to go and engage communities that step outside their ego and make a practice that's about social consciousness. And then there's the idea of the exhibition itself. I think it's important to remember these annual exhibitions had an enormous amount of money just for the budget to make the show happen, to produce the art, to do all these things that in post-socialist environments, and particularly in Romania, I think was a very extraordinary amount of money for just art production. And so
just art production, not also like
and exhibitions
or.
So artist fees are funny. I don't think many artists kind of made money. I think there would be some fees available, but most of it would go towards production, if I understand. I talked to an artist in Budapest this week who said he never got any actual money for all this work he was doing for the annual exhibitions. It was just production, access to materials, facilities, and delivery and PR. And then, of course, you got to meet all these curators when they came to town because you were in the network, right? So you were always kind of like, it was like betting on the horse, for the hopeful return. I can't universally say nobody got paid, but I know that a lot of people didn't get paid. Then the exhibition itself, though, for 010101, I don't think existed so much. It's like a very brief thing that happens for 2 days in November. And it always makes me question whether these were actually exhibitions or purely interventions in a social environment that reflected the interests and the agenda of the NGO. So it's like you get artists to be like a Trojan horse, to enter into these hotspots that are, orphanages, slums, mental institutions, things that are of definite interest of the open society. But of course, it's when it's under the auspices of art, you're going to let everybody in the front door.
Even the book has this first section of the archive itself to be consulted, but then you have the exhibition catalog, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there you see how many in the end?
50?
6 chapters of different themes of the exhibition. Should we go a little bit through this and define them, like shock therapy and how I will just go through them. Shock therapy, neoliberalization, precarity of the avant-garde, Soros realism, aspirational union, and tactical media literacy, lab and archive.
Yeah.
What are these? Are you referring to the artistic practices? Are you referring to the theme of the exhibition made by the Soros Center?
Oh yeah. So these are my language a little bit, but these are more common points of access of language that we hear around this. That the neoliberalism performed acts of shock therapy in the places where it was enacted, and particularly in former socialist countries, and And so these categories allowed me a chance to collect artworks that overlapped in interesting ways. Now it has to be clear: there's 50 artists in this show, and maybe only three are from the 90s. I maybe only had three actual artworks from the 90s. Most of this is like tracing a genetic, echo of stuff that's happening and different practices that I saw continually through the last 30 years. Even artists that had nothing to do with the NGO, they were just next generations. I took great care to have conversations to make because I know what it could feel like to say your practice is influenced and maybe not exactly yeah, it's complicated. All artists want to believe their actions are their own, and yet we all know that our choices are influenced by a variety of power structures around us. Um, but it's this creative process that with the open call, they're already inside the creative process of the artist from a point of inception. So the process and henceforth is going to be influenced and is purely the result of influence. But anyways, these themes were touchstones to help create a museum of trauma. In a way, I really like alternative museums. I like museums of propaganda. Because they're, I think, really the like the bleeding edge of what the art museum is trying to do nowadays, especially with social engaged practice, is constantly traumatize us with political realities through interesting ideas, curatorial practice or social engaged practice about identity art or climate change or other neoliberal political points. And all these things are important to talk about, by the way, but it's strange to see the whole entirety of contemporary art kind of get taken over by political messaging, and it's very specific political messaging. So I tried to create themes that some were invented themes, aspirational unions. That's a gallery that's the blue one, which I had a blue gallery and a red gallery. These are playing off the idea of the blue pill and the red pill, which are metaphors for political reality or and aspirational unions gallery was a way to think about the EU, but as an aspirational union, a desire, the perfect imagination of the globalist whole, and so it allowed me a chance to bring together art and make these statements that were more concise, little cosmologies. Soros realism is the one term that tends to come. Two terms come out of this when we talk about it historically. When you look at history books that do talk about the SCCA network, usually they talk about it through the lens of new media, which is a real soft and abstract kind of term. Means nothing really. It's like a nostalgic way to think about the future for what it means in the 90s. This net encompasses net art and net culture and new media practices, new technologies. But it was really a big movement, kind of, in the 90s. And then Soros realism, which is this new kind of identitarian art that is specific to the network in terms of getting artists to look at their identities as newly independent artists from Estonia, from wherever, and kind of take a conceptual form of art making that might be an international conceptual practice, filter it through a local aesthetic of materials or the self, and then end with a product which is a kind of an aspirational neoliberal, pro EU sense of the self. So the big part of the SCCA is also to inhibit or hinder ideas of nationalism. They don't want, I don't think they weren't wanting artists to be overly celebratory of the new national identities that were happening due to the breakup of the Soviet Union. They wanted to create a very aspirational pathway towards pro EU friendly senses of the self.
Well, I think it was quite radical to have a landscape or where identity is framed in uh, also through bureaucracy. I think as a practice in itself, it was very new here in Romania, but also after having years where the artists were expected to produce certain type of art that would serving the previous regime,
Hmm.
and all that meant the socialist realism. Now, it's quite controversial to say Soros realism, because most of the time when we think about art aesthetics produced within this network, we associate it with the freedom of expression.
Hmm.
Artists finally being empowered to explore their own perspective and experience.
Hmm.
Although the first time I heard someone speaking about the Soros Center in Romania was with a colleague I had in the university with double my years. I was too young in the 90s to have really any memories.
Me too.
And he said, you know what? In the 90s, the real radical art wasn't what was happening with the um, arts, like internet art and like the experiments within the centers themselves. The radical thing for the Romanian art scene was to express or to put in public spaces religious art. And he was referring to the whole phenomenon as a moment of schism within the local the society, where all the artists that were feeding their own imagination and the artistic process with like authentic vernacular problem like source of inspirations were totally left behind or ignored in favor of this this type of exhibitions. Um, and yeah, I was thinking uh, how of a leap it is to see what spiritual are meant for the artist here, and then how you frame this as being spiritual.
Hmm. Hmm.
And in what in contemporary landscape, how do you connect identity with spirituality, especially when you talk so much about bureaucracy and technology?
Well, bureaucracy and technology are the two kind of main entry points to magical thinking. The way in which we allow ourselves to perceive energy through language, perceive the spiritual, the ineffable. We're always putting words on these things, and then technology is then of course the magical stuff. The in terms of any Arthur C. Clarke's quote, any advanced technology is indecipherable from magic. It really applies to this story because a lot of the technologies that were being rolled out in that time were the most advanced for their times, and they were highly contrary to the landscape. But this idea of identity, especially socially engaged practice, but which has led us to this kind of strange identitarian moment that is happening in contemporary art. This is the new religion. Our new religion that we have in the face of atheism and liberalism is narcissism and it's humanitarianism, the way in which people have turned politics into dogma to give themselves an incredible spiritual energy, deserves kind of a mirror, honestly, because it looks pretty unhealthy. In my country, it's toxic, and these paths are not leading us to a holistic place. Neither narcissism or political dogma. They're just radicalizing people in sectarian ways because and they overlap. Nobody's as hardcore as I am about this subject, and you see the neoliberalism kind of is auto cannibalistic in that great way. because they become like sectarian within, and that's kind of a funny narcissism of like who's more hardcore about caring, or caring so much you're outing your friend for being, I don't know, I don't understand. It's I've left America 4 months ago. I moved to Denmark because my wife is Danish and we have kids, and I am not cool with raising kids in this place that feels like a fucking experiment that's folding in on itself. So anyways, these are spiritual phenomena. What these neoliberal pathways give, they're just the wrong kinds of spiritual phenomena. And I'm not advocating for like a conventional God idea. I'm just like, this isn't working. Neoliberalism in terms of how it's giving us spiritual energy is it's not good.
What echoes did this message have, especially in the landscape where you produce now this exhibition, which is the Ujadowski Castle? Um, they, like, politically, they are seen as being taken over by a direct, like how do you call it, the director of the museum being right wing. How is this political landscape then aligning with your message?
So, mm, yeah, this is really special. I'm engaged in, I think, true experiments in this way because I always knew that my exhibition could be politicized. But I knew in my intention, I'm really good about framing stuff, and I knew I couldn't be pinned. You could see my show as a pro Soros show, or you could see it as an anti Soros show. It could be whatever you want it to be, depending on your mood. And and I truly believe that the blue pill version of the show, the neoliberal, pro Soros version of the show, should be the way we see it, if because that's what most of our industry is in terms of demographic. Look at this fucking radical NGO that was way ahead of the game with the social engaged practice, curatorial practice, all these things that are now. It was like they predicted the future or they created it. There's a great way to celebrate this. It's a celebration of the avant-garde in its most scientific form, and or it can go another way. It can go a scary way. And so I was invited by the director Piotr Bernatowicz from the Ujadowski Castle to remake the show. And what to say, I operated in secret for 16 months. I didn't tell anybody what I was working on. It was also COVID times, and I was just in a real space with this. And but I made all the artists swear to secrecy. But I had really productive 2 hour long conversations with every one of these artists about what the implications of doing it in this place would be, all the predictable things, the problems, and it was such a learning experience. Every conversation was an amazing learning experience about what it's going to do to this show, how it's going to change the narrative, and how my show will be summed up very easily as a right-wing anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. And I was like, let's treat that like a gift. If that's a given, then that's for Christmas. Let's accept that. And let's just know that let's think about that tactically. If we can guarantee it, let's think about it tactically and use it. And so, what did it mean to do it there? It meant, yeah, me working in secret. It meant I've lost a lot of friendships. I've betrayed my industry. This is a boycotted institution. No one's allowed to collaborate with them. No one's allowed to look at them. You're definitely not allowed to celebrate them. And I'm not here to support right-wing politics. I'm not a political person. This, for me, is, of course, can be interpreted as an act of political activism, but I would much rather that it be seen as an intervention into political consciousness. It's something that's allowing us to understand influence and how political dogmas are, pushing us in all these unhealthy ways. And so the response has been kind of amazing because on the one hand, there haven't really been reviews from the mainstream media. It's been ignored. and that's a strategy. It's a definite, press strategy to make a blanket block of this, because you can't just simply say that my show is a run of the mill right wing show at the right wing castle that's making the shitty right wing art shows. You can't say that. I've got a an amazing pantheon of all the great artists, a NATO-esque selection of all these great artists from the region of Eastern Europe, and on top of that, an incredible generation of next generation of very young artists from America dealing with tactical media. There's no way that you can just dismiss my show, and I knew that. I knew that the quality of the material and the message would be the kryptonite for that basic reflex to dismiss my show. Um, but what did I want to say? Yeah. So I kind of lost my train of thought there. But the response has been bizarre, because people are using my show as a way to continue a very long press campaign to discuss the castle and the motives of the castle, and look, this is just another example of that. But no one's interviewing me, no one's engaging in my content, no one's definitely engaging in my thesis, of these three things. No one, because it hurts, what I'm suggesting really hurts. And what I wanted to say, the great, phenomenal irony, the scientifically phenomenal irony of all this is, if we do take what I'm saying, that there's this emergent phenomena of socially engaged practice that happens through the NGO movement, there's going to be this eventual full circle, and you have suddenly right-wing socially engaged practice that's mirroring it back to you. And that's what the art world hates most right now, is that they're looking at this castle and what it's doing, and it's taking all our tricks, all our conceptual tricks, all our socially engaged practice tricks, and they're using it to further a right wing agenda. And that's been phenomenal to see. Not because I like right wing stuff, but I believe in anthropology, and I believe in embedding myself, and I've learned so much about propaganda. How art is propaganda. And the funny thing is, when you call it that, when you call this this is an exhibition about art as propaganda, and that all exhibitions are essentially servicing some kind of propagandistic function, it really, when you see it in this right-wing museum especially, I don't know, I think it really has this incredible mirroring effect, where we can now see the whole kind of the whole thing as like, oh, yeah, it is this echo chamber of propaganda. It's kind of an obvious thing to say. I know a lot of people are thinking that, but it's great to have a way that just kind of proves it in a really direct way, rather than we're all kind of complaining behind closed doors that our institutions are just arms of propaganda.
It raises a difficult barrier then, like what you're saying is basically museum started to exhibit non-art or propaganda dressed in like nice aesthetics, and becomes problematic. Okay, then how do you find real art, or how would you define then, like who are the gatekeepers of this, what it used to be the holy grail of societies?
I'm just one person. I have a different idea. We all have great different ideas of art and what we want from art. You know, I think we all have. We know it in the back of our heads, even though art is such this amorphous thing, and nobody really knows what it is, and it can be anything, and that's this great way in which it can be a placebo or a Trojan horse or whatever. But I'm a firm believer in art and its ability to help us find new kinds of spiritual experience. I do look for the sublime. I do look for a thing that's going to maybe make me cry, or like, not that I'm looking for like some emotional trauma. It's like we're existing in my paradigm in the U.S. It's a spiritually bankrupt country. People are looking to narcissism and politics to get the spiritual nutrition, and it's like a bunch of potato chips they're eating, and so and I think, like, I don't know, I've just gone rogue with my interest in trying to find the spiritual within art practice, and And it's not so simple as that, the way that sounds. I'm looking for all kinds of games, ultimately. Tactical media is everything for me. That's my new way. I'm just going to refer to great art is tactical media, and variations on that theme, because those are the things that instill faith. These things that disrupt the shit out of our perception. Those are actually the things that create whole new pathways of believing, in new realities, new possibilities. So that's what I look for. But I also respect the hell out of somebody who just likes great painting. Not for me. I like particular kinds of painting, but it's not. But you know what? It's. I don't know where you find it, to be honest. But I think making artists be activists is a problem. It's not what artists. And it's funny because also with technology too, artists are used to. They're the first, like Google and AI industry will use artists to help further the potentials of creativity in the artificial sense. That's so fucking dangerous. But it's like the artist gets this access to these materials and this technology, and it's like they make a super cool project that 2 years later looks really dated. But they're used by these corporations to help further the technology, to find the bugs, to see how the general public's going to react to it through this Trojan horse of the artist. And the artist is this somehow now this canary in the coal mine on a variety of levels for research and development of something that has nothing to do with their creativity. It helps their creativity, and hopefully it helps their career, and hopefully they get some money out of it. But there's this, I think like artists for me are shaman. They're the real shaman that we have all around us that are permitted to be shaman. And I don't, necessarily want all artists to go and put on that hat, because they're not all meant to. But I think that's what
I don't know. I feel a little bit conflicted about that because you are now describing a machine that is directing imaginative energy towards a political scope or towards a pre-established end. So in this sense, artists, art is not propaganda, but it's how it's directed towards a certain reading of the reality in which these artists are living. And you think art, like, what were the feedback you received during the other two events you've been part of around this book launch? Artists that were actually partaking in this endeavor, were they what was their response to saying that they became activists without them acknowledging it?
This only reason this happens is because I have such a long relationship with some of these artists. Like I had a gallery, I represented them, and we were in constant dialogues for business and passions, and like Luchazar Boyagiev or Daniel Baker. Luchazar really is like the face of that generation of SCCA artists in Bulgaria, and it's when I started talking to him, he's has no regrets and thinks about it in a righteous, very good way, whatever it was. But he knows that this thing, it does need a second guess, and maybe I've done a hard, I don't want to say irresponsible thing the way I've told this story, but the reality is no one's telling this story, and no one in 30 years. There were 20 great curators that came out of this, that some of them remain extremely powerful, important people in our industry, and none of them have decided to do this book. Right? There's this guy Octavian Asanu who did just come out with a book at the same time, but there's 20 of these guys, and I think there's a big black hole in this history, and there's a reason for that. There is a reason for that, and I don't know what it is. But the feedback I got, so I did this in Warsaw, and and Budapest. And Warsaw is where the exhibition was. But Warsaw, in terms of the network, there were, again, 20 cities. Warsaw only existed from 92 to 93. It was like the impact was felt the least. There were no big annual exhibitions in Warsaw. There was no major visible impact because Warsaw had an already autonomous, standalone art scene that, I think the SCCA saw its role there as redundant. And so they didn't really pursue it, and the SCCA kind of disintegrated and became the Stefan Batory Foundation, which became just a fully philanthropic thing about supporting art, creating publications, but there was a real backstage role, really soft power, just helping make exhibitions happen. And so, a lot of people argue that, why are you doing this in Warsaw? This story isn't here. This isn't, this is not our story, and it's true. I can't deny that. But the museum is the only museum on planet Earth that wanted the show. I've definitely pitched it to a lot of places, and I knew the risks and the potential gains of using that context. And so they might not make sense in Warsaw, but it makes sense for the 21st century and for 2022, and I want to see this thing happen. And so in Warsaw, it was a lot of like people kind of showing how meaningless this idea was here, in terms of arguing with what my thing was. And also it's important to know that my show is not just an exhibition, an innocent exhibition. I fully embody and invoke a lot of my ideas. I use tactical media, and I used a lot of experiments in tactical media. I brought real witches into this gallery that made you think about the EU as the like a church, a church to the globalist cabal. And then I got these real witches that I just hung out with today to do a ritual in there. Polish Catholic people don't think that shit's funny at all. And then I dressed up like Baal and did a TV show inside of it. So it's like I really activated this space. I embodied it. The true value of what I see, the magical relationships of these ideas and these objects in this room, turning it into an altar and then treating it like one, for a ritual. Fuck yeah. That, and then, no, that's cool, guys. Let's just call it art. Because that's what the SCCA people did, right? They went in and they were like, hey, we're gonna play with your monuments. Is that cool? No, it's just art. Don't worry. We're gonna play with your all your social structures. Is that cool? No, it's just art. There's this whole way in which art allows you to open your front door and let it right in. And so I did all that stuff in this, and they were weirded out by it because they didn't know what I was doing. And I used a lot of other kinds of tricks too, not just spiritual, tactical tricks, but I studied whole histories of black propaganda, active measures, all the nastiest ways in which we as humans fuck with each other. And I used some of those tricks too. I called them art. And because it became a way to use this thing recursively, because it's not just an exhibition catalog, it's a procedures manual. It's a way to help you figure out some tricks for yourself. And so, yeah, in Poland, they're not, the right-wing people are, I think they're happy about the show, but they also don't know I don't think they got it, I don't think they didn't realize they let a vampire in their front door, because I'm not right-wing, and I'm a chaos agent of chaos, I'm a Trojan horse, I'm doing all these things because they let me in. And and then in Budapest, wow, that was so incredible, because I had actual people in the audience who were a part of all the early stuff, that were in this most important socially engaged practice show, which is for me the template show called Polyphony. And they were there, and on my panel I had this guy, Janos Sugar, who was the husband of Susie Masoli, who was the executive director of the network. Janos was arguably one of the artists who benefited most from being in the network in terms of the arc of how you could have success in this thing. He was in bed with the boss, and so he really but he's also a phenomenal artist and a legit tactical media, like OG tactical media grandfather. And so that was an honor to sit on stage with him, but he also lends an incredible amount of legitimacy to my idea. He was also in the show, and he was so he had some reservations about how I package my story, uh, which we could talk about. But he ultimately, he agrees with it, and he's just shocked that no one in 30 years has not done this. And in terms of the audience that it landed on, uh, that was a real discovery for me. In Budapest, you have first, second, third, fourth generation tactical media people. So if Warsaw was the place this mattered the least, Budapest was a place that this was the most prolific, and it existed there the longest. And so these ideas of what happens when you plant that seed and it grows over time. I was meeting all these amazing younger generations of people who are doing their PhD in tactical media. Their practice is all about it. They're in fully formed, new states of political consciousness in kind of response to this. Things that we're just barely putting words on in the West. In terms of like anti-neoliberalism, neoliberalism is a pretty new concept for Americans, which is ironic because it's really what represents our colonial practice. But most Americans, my father included, didn't know what neoliberalism was, and that's not a indicator of the whole society, but it's important. So anti-neoliberalism is a pretty new concept, and I think it's going to get easily chewed up in like anti-woke or all these kind of ways in which liberals are naming things to disempower them, which is a form of spellcasting, and so I met this generation of people who were very excited to have this conversation, and then it's Hungary. It's the land of Viktor Orban and anti-Soros mentality, but I don't feel like there were any of those people in the room. I felt like there was an incredibly advanced group of thinkers and practitioners that I was humbled to be in their presence, and exchange energy with them and share stories and have this conversation. And yeah.
What about the feedback you had from Bucharest last time you had a public talk with Clindan and Hert Loving?
And Luchazar?
And Luchazar, yes. Maybe it would be worth saying who's Hert Loving and what was his attitude towards your story.
Yeah, Herr Levenk is really important. He's considered to be the father of tactical media, and he's a young anarchist, or in the 80s, in 90s, he's like a young anarchist leftist who gets linked up with the network, and I'm not entirely clear on his exact story, but I've interviewed him 3-4 times, and he has this amazing way of talking about this stuff. But anyways, he is in a variety of other network culture spaces at the time that he's also working closely with the early years of the SCCA network, and he is considered to be the person who comes up with this idea of tactical media. And it's at an event called The Next 5 Minutes, which is a Dutch event where they're looking at new media space and tactical uses of media space, and they did an event called Tactical Television, and it's in that one I think you see tactical media really form properly in this applied way. But Geert is a legend just for that alone, for his tactical media stuff, but he traveled around the network, even to Bucharest a bunch, and was this pedagogical mentor of the whole early days of educating people about advanced ideas of practice, and Geert is one of the people who's one of the he's an incredible critical thinker, and he's one of the first insiders of the network who kind of left and started to question it critically and interview people around it. What did this mean for you? Blah 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 blah. So I knew I had a kinship with him just from reading his stuff and my interest in tactical media. So I invited Geert and Clindan, who was the director of the Soros Center in Bucharest, and Luchazar Boyagiev, who was important artist from Bulgaria, and I was quite intense as a moderator because I was in a high energy space. But I I was trying to figure out my thesis with them in public, and I had a couple of breakthrough moments in that. But the real thing with the Bucharest experience for me is this review that happened, which was by a guy named Ioanu Ciorba. It's not his real name. It's a pseudonym. It's a guy who I think has passed away in the last couple of years, and he wrote.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so he wrote a 20-page, super intense review of my show for Shana number 9, Shana 9. It's, yeah, and man, it was literally like coming at my show, really. I think it's easy to misunderstand what I'm doing. Like a lot of people, their biggest complaint is like, Soros did not bring contemporary art here. We had contemporary art, we had contemporary art practice, and this was another thing within that landscape of change. And I'm not saying that. I'm saying from the macro view, when we look at the whole NGO phenomena, there's this thing that happens. I'm not saying for every single place they were in, they brought this idea of contemporary art, but there are documented instances in Kishinev or in Tallinn. It's the first time they meet a curator, all these kind of ideas in certain places are in fact introduced for the first time. But it's really I'm always looking at the curatorial practice, this history of the curatorial practice. So anyways, most of his article is spent defending the art history, the pre-existing histories of socially or social-like engaged practice of Romania, and just as a way to say how stupid my show is, and then he has a couple of really hard, weird things that he says, like whether I even talk to any artists to get their permission to use their work in this context, which I have pride myself on dialogue with artists and don't talk. There's not a single person I collaborate with that I don't have an intimate relationship with. So that's always very hurtful when somebody writes shit like that. And then he said I was an anti-Semite because I did not talk about anti-Semitism in my show. So therefore I was an anti-Semite because I did not talk about this issue of anti-Semitism. It's like, yeah, it's
backfiring.
Yeah, but it's like it was that was a phenomenal you just can't win with that, and that was intense because that everybody of course locally read that, and but it didn't bother me. It was all of that stuff is good.
That you kind of play with the stick through the fence, right? You use this aesthetics of conspirational thinking. You put the figure of Soros inside the exhibition, and you talk about how dangerous globalization or the certain practices within globalization are for political consciousness and even further away to human consciousness.
Maybe I'm right wing. Just kidding. So no, here's the thing. What I look at it as is like, I don't like being like liberals, but because I'm liberal, I technically voted Democrat. I'm a liberal, but I'm anti-neoliberal. That's what I really am. And but when you tell me that it's going to be this, it's going to be this, it's going to be this, and it's going to be this, that it's going to be an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, that it's going to be seen like this, it's going to be this, I'm like, what happens if I do that? Because it's not my intention to do that, but like you are projecting that so hard into this. What happens if I play with your expectations a little bit? And so so it's not like I was like trying. It's not. So there is all this dangerous language around this thing. Only allowing ourselves to understand George Soros as a boogeyman or as someone who is perceived as a boogeyman creates this funny sectarian thought pattern that he's a boogeyman. Somebody thinks he's a boogeyman or he's a boogeyman. Depending on your point of view. that is ridiculous. That throws critical thinking out the door, and that prevents us from actually ever looking at this person with clear vision. It's just emotional triggers to make us go one way or another. It creates hysteria, whatever. So I don't know. For me, there were all these things that I like to call gifts that were given to me, and how I could make this thing embody what people wanted it to be, because it was like, I mean, I don't want it to be these things necessarily, but I'm not given a neutral terrain, either be it because of the context of the right wing castle or because liberals, the great irony about the anti-Semitic stuff is I've spent all this time with the right wing people. I've never had a single conversation that was I could call anti-Semitic with them. That shit would be a red flag for me. I was always on the lookout. The only people who have projected anti-Semitic conspiracy theories into my show are liberals and the media. They're the people that are putting it onto my work, and does and the excuse is because it's what they think. That's what they think. It's not what we think, but they think that. But we're going to now platform anti-Semitic conspiracy theory in front of your show. In my opinion, that kind of makes you an anti-Semite. Even if it's like the intention is different, you're still propagating anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. And so what to say? I mean, I do this kind of dance with these things, with these symbols, dressing up like Baal.
Inside Ujadovsky Castle.
Inside Ujadovsky Castle, inside my this room that's this EU altar room. I mean, it's like, it's playing with fire, but I also benefit from what I believe to be this face-off that tactical media offers you, and also the perception that I'm a prankster or a trickster or whatever, which is a great kind of, gift that I have. It's a way people dismiss my work, that I'm not being serious, but I'm actually maybe being sincere. But I love the fact that I have this gift that you think I'm a joker.
Well, it's hard to say how you are a joker when you put inside Ujadovsky a EU church, and then you put a what was it called,
Pentagram.
Pentagram. Like you are annoying both the liberals and the right wing, and then you bring inside artists who are really extreme left activists that use imagery, and yeah, that's another interesting aspect of the project, that you make no kind of difference between high art and popular folkloric art and non-art.
Yeah. I mean, I believe in the Trojan horse, and some of the great feedback I got from artists was, don't give the right wing a softball. Don't give them this thing that they want, which is a Soros conspiracy show, or don't feed their political agenda. Don't make it easy for them. And I was like, this is not about the right wing, though. This is about neoliberalism. It's a thing we're not allowed to talk about, and it's like it needs this moment. But I hear you, and I'm listening. And I'm not going to give the right wing a softball. And so I believe in the Trojan horse, and I believe nobody gets to win. And so inside my Trojan horse, the right wing, they let me in the front door. And inside my Trojan horse, I had all these hardcore leftists that are this group Do Not Research from the U.S. And like, their practice is amazing. They're all a bunch of, there's like 100 of these guys or 50 of these guys. They're all amazing. They're worth looking up. They're a real amazing young generation of Zoomer artists. They're all in their 20s, and then there were the witches, which the right wing people were very scared of my work with the occult. They told me that straight away, that they wanted no occult shit happening inside this show. I was like, okay, how can I spiritualize the political? And then I had these, so I had these, the Romanian witches that we had lunch with today, who I knew I was playing with dark energy with this subject because of George Soros, because of the right wing thing, because of all the intense energy that's around this thing. I was like, I need a shaman. I need a real shaman that's going to help neutralize this energetic space. It'll at least make me feel really good about, just going into whatever this is, this energetic battleground. And so I contacted Mihaela Minka and her daughters and asked if they would help me do a cultural exorcism of neoliberalism. That was literally what I said to them. And they were like, absolutely, anything for you. And I got them to, I found the money for getting them to come. And and the right wing people at this point, I'm like too much for them to handle. I'm a high energy person. I got all these ideas I'm throwing out, and I do the American charm thing. And so, it gets to this point though where they're just saying yes to me because they don't know how to say no to me. And I know how these people work. They try to drop the axe at the last minute. They're like, we don't have money for that. We don't have money for that. And then it's like, and I'm just, I get it. There's all these basic strategies. And, so they did try to block the witches. And I just want to tell the witch, the pentagram story. They did try to block the witches a bunch, saying there was no money. And I ended up paying $2,000 of my own money just to make sure they had a nice hotel for their time there. And that wouldn't, and then because the budget became so small, I needed them to be paid, And so I just, made sure I was on a runaway train. I'm like, you're not fucking canceling my witches. So there's this moment about 3 days before the opening where the right-wing people are like super fun with me all the time. We're all homies, right? And because I came there, I'm embedded with them, and I told them, I'm like, I'm not right wing, I don't agree with your politics, but we're gonna do a cool fucking show, and so they were certain, however, that this was my coming out party, and I was gonna be like, I'm actually right wing, guys, they were positive I would just come out in front of everybody, and then 3 days before, the vibe changed. Like the way they were behaving around me changed. Like I'm good at sensing energy, and they were all like either flush red or white in their face around me, and they were agitated, and I was like, oh, I bet it's the witches, and because the witches are coming and they're about to arrive, and it's really intense. It's not a joke, because they're right wing Catholics, and this is real, and and they told me no occult stuff. And but what happened was my director that I was working with, Marcel, 3 days before, he comes up to my assistant and, with this coming out idea in mind, he's like, hey, I think he's just here to make noise. And Sarah was like, yeah, he's not right wing. And it was like, duh, of course I'm here to make fucking noise, thank you for the opportunity, but I'm not going to, suddenly be like, I'm right wing. So that was amazing. Sarah told me that, and I was like, I need to address this energy sooner than later because it could go bad, and we're about to go time. And so I came up to Marcel, and I was like, dude, I can sense some tension, and I want to just make sure we're good because stuff's going to heat up soon, and I just want to make sure. Is there anything we need to talk about? Is there any issues? Is it the witches? Like, is there any? Just keep a line of communication open with me, and I want to make sure you're comfortable. And he was like, without missing a beat, he's like, don't put any inverted crosses in the blue room. And I was like, no problem, bro, no problem, no upside down crosses, and. But I knew what was going to happen, and I knew we were going to put a pentagram in there, and so we did the pentagram late at night, the night before the opening, so no one would have the chance to say anything, and so it would just be there the day of the opening, and then when Marcel saw it for the first time, I was like, listen, man, I want you to not give this thing any power, okay? Because if you give it power and if you cancel it, it's going to make it worse for you. And it's going to make it worse for your people. And it's going to fuck with you more than if you just allow it to be there. Now, I'm going to give you a magic trick. I'm going to give you a magic trick, and it's going to totally make everything fine. I want you to call it art. I want you to call them artists. I want you to call this an installation. And what they're going to do tonight is a performance. I want you to take its power away. Because that's exactly what the Soros people did when they marched into those situations like a Trojan horse. They called it art. And that allowed them this open access to do it. And mind you, I'm playing with a double game with that. But anyways, he was kind of convinced. But then I was like, and hey, man, isn't this funny? Like, this room, it's all about the European Union and the globalist cabal, this whole kind of fantasy about a conspiracy about the European Union, and we're going to do like a satanic ritual in here. Isn't that fucking hilarious? And he thought that was so funny, and we all just kind of laughed. But it was like about a real spinning on my toes moment of code switching and making it make sense. Of course, it's like a good argument, it's convincing, but I'm a believer in that stuff. That was a strange moment for me personally in my own work of like not just convincing somebody, but of really applying a methodology in a way that was recursive to the methodology of the network.
Yes, I think that is detail in the project that you say all of your steps taken into the project were reenactment of what you saw to be it first enacted by the Soros Center. You did an interview with Susie Mazzoli, the director of
The network.
the network. What was her response to your observation? Where was the inspiration she took for to implement and to develop these kind of protocols?
Yeah. Susie's a funny one. And I can tell you an Easter egg about this book with her. But Susie was this executive director of the Soros Network and was the youngest in the whole network. She was by leaps younger than everybody. A very young, powerful Hungarian-Australian woman who is running a 20-center network of, like, she's basically the queen of Eastern Europe, essentially. And she was going to, really taking this network and all the power and potential it had and putting it into San Paolo Biennial and to Venice and into Manifesta and into Documenta and because it wasn't just about having these great artists, but it was the philanthropic support on top of that. And so, and then Susie's story is incredible. It's like a real story of a transformed life. I made and basically Susie did 8 years of dedicated service to the network, 9 years dedicated service, built this unprecedented phenomenon, and then was fired and thrown away like garbage just one day to the next. And she disappeared to be reborn as a New Age guru leading shamanic ayahuasca rituals in Peru. And yeah. Yeah. And I just when I was in Budapest, she's in Peru right now with her shaman. I got this like text photo of her with her shaman, and she's a shaman, and so and it's the most incredible story about a healer, somebody who was always a healer, right? And so Susie doesn't do interviews about this stuff. She doesn't talk about it. A couple people have gotten her on tape about it, but she's in a new place. And so I approached her through the New Age. I approached her through her New Age practice. And I kind of, I don't like saying I tricked her but my motive was to access her 90s stories. And, but I knew that if I could get her to, if you get somebody talking about what they want to talk about, you can eventually get them to talk about what you want them to talk about. And I formed a relationship with Susie that's been incredible, and a real representation of how deep I go with my own anthropological practice. And so Susie, The first interview I did with her, I didn't tell her anything about what I was really doing. I was just like, I just want to talk. I happen to be an expert. I told her, you and I are on the same path. That's literally what I said to her. We are on the same path, Susie. I happen to be an expert in this thing that you were a part of, and I too am in the New Age and work with people from the occult and so and so, and and I just really would like to talk to you about your path and what it's meant. And she was like, I'm interested. This is interesting. And so we had this first conversation, which was great. Uh, and it was mostly about the 90s. And then we had a second conversation where I needed to interview her just to fact check some stuff. And then I explained that I'm doing this thing that's an homage to you, an homage to your work as the director. It's not going to talk about you so directly, but your voice is present. Your voice is there's works in the documentaries and stuff and things about her. It's like this is definitely about your legacy. Know that I'm telling a complicated story, but I think it's a good story and it's an important story. I'm not telling a negative story, but it's definitely going to be complicated. And she was supportive. I was very open with her. She said just as long as you have a human scale statue of me at the entrance made of chocolate. Things like that. She was like fully, though, wholeheartedly supportive because I think a part of her is like fuck this history. They had no allegiance to me in the end, and everyone walked away from Susie as soon as she wasn't the powerful Susie Masoli. Her whole world kind of disappeared. All this whatever she had built. So she saw how callous and sociopathic the art world can be in this way that made her never want to look back. And so I don't think she has a big qualm about thinking critically about it. And then I because I had this access to her in this first show in 2019, I was like, I can't lose this relationship. There's such an enormous story in here that I'm only just at the tip of. Susie, can I come to your house with a film crew? Can we shoot a documentary about your life? And she was like, yeah. And we had this great dialogue at that point. It was still good. And I got an important filmmaker from LA that's my good homie. And we went there and spent 4 days with Susie under the auspices of doing a documentary about her life. But then knowing I'm going to do like a hard deep dive on the SCCA stuff on camera. And so we spent like 2.5 days talking about SCCA stuff, which she was so pissed about after 2 days. She was like, we haven't talked about any of my magical practice at all. I was like, we're going to do that. We're going to do that. But what the dialogue opened up was ultimately she saw that Mike and I were these great creatives. And she was like, I want in on that. And so together, the three of us started to do some awesome shit where Susie let us in fully into her New Age practice. And so she does channeling for us in front of a green screen. She did like 3 hours of channeling in front of a green screen. She organized a huge sound healing ceremony, sound with sound bowls. And there's one point in our interview where we go from like her living room to like she lays me down on her Reiki table. And I'm still interviewing her, but she's doing Reiki healing on me. This is so weird. And anyways, and that documentary has never been made. We made a 20-minute thing that you kind of see imagery of there, where it's the green Susie stuff, and that's all about the magical practice. But in it, we get to touch on this idea of Susie as a healer universally, and that the work of the NGO and her work with the NGO was through the intention of healing. It's a very special film in that way. You can see it on my YouTube channel. But Susie has been supportive, and that's for how conflicting of a narrative, and I get a lot of people against my story. They're usually people that are from the periphery. They're not from the center. They're people that were kind of cameos, or that saw this stuff, or generations afterward who literally should shut the fuck up. I've gotten Garrett Levink and Susie and I've interviewed so many people, and I'm very forthright about my intentions. I test my ideas. Some people aren't willing to fully agree with them. Susie, for example, hates when I say the word social engineering. She does not agree with me using those words, but she knows that she can't control the usage of those words around what was clearly experiments in social engineering. So
But
that's
what is, in the end, your intention behind it? Is it to take upon yourself this journey of healing the contemporary context, this kind of non-stop debating between the left and the right, what is going on mostly in America but starts to be very present here, or is it break to break the art world? You know,
I think it's these can arguably be the same thing. Uh, this idea that I should have a goal or a solution. I think these are really misunderstood. I'm a small human on Earth, and I have a platform and I have a weird research project, and uh, and I believe that I believe chaos is actually enough. If we want to really change things in society, I think you have to kind of throw in an arbitrary and nonpartisan chaos. And maybe it breaks all things. Scorched earth is a really dark way to look at it. But from that, we can build new things. I do believe that. It's not that my project is going to do that, but my project will create an irreversible conversation that's going to now start happening where there hasn't been the ability for that conversation to happen. This is an invisible topic in art history, and it's an invisible topic in the West, and people don't realize how maybe meaningful it is for their everyday life. Uh, and in Eastern Europe, it's very different. I know that I'm treading on sacred ground, telling this story. It's not my story. I'm not from here. Uh, but in 30 years, no one's telling this story properly. And so what are we going to keep waiting for? It's like, oh, these people die soon. George is going to die any day now. And then we are left with this thing that always happens with problematic histories. They're told through secondhand sources, and there's no one there to second guess. This is almost any great historical narrative is, empowered by the death of the witnesses. So I don't know. I do have good intentions, but I also don't like the state of the art world. I truly don't. I think there's something unhealthy happening, and it's mostly in the West. But I see it. I see these ideas from the West being, there's like, I don't know. Yeah, I don't have like a true holistic goal beyond chaos with this. And
but you see chaos in a kind of anthropological way as a kind of a potential new energy to.
Well, I've been calling this a cultural exorcism. I mean, and I truly believe that that's what it is. This is a hidden story there, and I'm gonna bring it out and release it. And I'm doing that through invoking all the dark energies around it, but I'm also engaging in rituals to really make it a cultural exorcism. I went to the witches today to help me close the circle. I went to them to just say hi and to say thank you and to give them books, and then I had this very heartfelt moment because I believe in what I'm doing and I need people to help me help this process because this has been an all-consuming possession for me, and I'm done now, and this is it. After this meeting today, I'm never gonna say his name again, and I'm okay with that. He'll be GS, and but the witches were important for me to put actual ritual closure and close the circle for me and close this story for me, and so I do believe it is a cultural exorcism. It's a story that I'm telling against all odds, against my industry, against even the majorities of the places where this happened don't want somebody like me telling the story in this way. But that's the problem is like social engaged practice. Putting a mirror up is it's not always meant to be a friendly process, and shouldn't always be done with the permission of the institution or the permission of the industry. And I think and that's the funny thing about when you say social engaged practice has a political agenda, that's really hardcore and specific. People are like, you don't want to save the planet? I'm like, that's not what it's about, man. I don't feel like it's my role to be an activist with my creative work. I'd like to think about other things, honestly. Um,
Well, in this way, you took a little bit of creative liberty because you talk about the Soros procedures being actually very political.
hmm
Um,
yeah. Yeah.
I was thinking to go back to this. Hmm?
It's 6.
Ah, wow. Well, last thought, I would say it is about this irreversible topic. One is this notion of the value or the how the network of NGO operated in the case of the Soros Center and the Open Society Foundation. And the other aspect of it is the legacy they left behind, both in terms of curatorial practices, also in the value that the that was produced within this network has today. What are the lives of, like, let's go back to the real case here. Kalindan is one of the factors that played both as an artist, and today he's the director of the Museum of Contemporary Art. By chance, yesterday we went together to the museum for the opening of the new season, and there is the show of the exhibition of Ion Grigorescu. And you were the one to say, but I have this book of the work of Ion Grigorescu during an exhibition produced by the Soros
On
Center.
my phone, I have all the old Soros catalogs. I have this fetish collection.
So,
So I would take pictures of them. I'd go to archives and just be like, I take pirated copies of these books. And so I have on my phone all these books. And I'm like, this dude was in 010101, and I thought Ex Oriente Lux, but I had both books on my phone, and he was not in Ex Oriente Lux. But go on, sorry.
but then we have at present this interesting example of Kalindan curating Ion Grigorescu, and we had an interesting discovery within the exhibition where you have a series of photographs taken by Ion Grigorescu from the 70s until the early 2000s, and you say, but you have here some missing years, the 1988 and 1989
Yeah.
in his works,
In the timeline, yeah.
yeah, are not highlighted in any way. And beside this sea of imagery, you pointed out to me the topic that Ion Grigorescu approached for the Soros Center.
Well, and that was the thing, and then that was curated by Colin Don, and it's Colin Don's choice to not historicize himself within Ion Grigorescu's career. But I was like, this guy made a project for Colin Don's show, and Colin Don's trying to create a context, and certainly we don't have to imagine that he's going to say, and this was made for 01010101. But there's nothing. Essentially, if we have to talk about the legacy of these things, the interesting thing about Ion Grigorescu's project, I recognized a photo amongst the sea of photos, and I was like, that's from the catalog of 010101. I didn't see the show, but to me, that is from the roll of film where he's doing his socially engaged research. I read you the description, going into an orphanage and photographing stuff, and suddenly there's this one image, which is the same image in the book I have on my phone, and it's just in a sea of images. And I just thought, isn't that a strange pity? That it's a grain of sand suddenly now, and I don't know. I don't know how to think about it because
Well, for me, it was an interesting coincidence because
that's projecting, a desire too, but.
well, the reality was that the project the image was part of was talking about the relocation of the church in Bucharest, and this tension between the spirituality and the material realism of communism still survives very much today.
Mhm.
We we have this resistance towards talking in any way about spirituality in a serious manner.
Mm-hmm.
And you then further complicate the topic by putting spirituality together with conspiracy theory thinking or logic.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder what this will produce further for artistic production.
Well, there. I think conspiracy theory and politics are these two main sources of religion nowadays, and that's hilarious because Karl Popper, who's the mentor of George Soros and the father of the Open Society, or the writer of the Open Society and its enemies, he had this often quoted thing about conspiracy theory, that it's the natural byproduct of a society without religion. When we get religion out of society, it's only natural that humans will look for mystery within themselves and look for these power structures and these supreme or other kinds of power structures, occult power structures within the society itself, and that's just how it will go if you don't allow them to put that intuition or reflex else into that other place, and so the big problem with this story ultimately is when you hide things, when you don't deal with your past in the proper way, it will come back to haunt you. And I think that's what this is. This is it's not meant to be a ghost story. It's meant to be a history book. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's art history. But it just now is so politicized. Who can tell this history? Why aren't we telling this history?
Mm-hmm.
All of that. It's so easy now to use this language of conspiracy theory around this thing, which is not a healthy place to be, honestly. But I looked at it as a gift. And thanks for that.
I think there are many questions that could be further raised, and one of the last I want just to launch and not to engage in it is like if there would be a way to engage in a collaborative manner with more curators to say transnational stories, which I think are more and more present into how art and culture is shaped today. And beyond this, I want to thank everyone for the patience to have listened to our conversation. And maybe you want to participate with questions, and we can do that upstairs in the coffee area.
And I have many copies of the book. We said €10, but I don't know what that is in lei. But it's
50 lei. Which we hope to be a present to the
it's
local. The Trojan horse again.
Let me in your front door.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.